Imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting in a crowded auditorium.
Okay.
The lights are dimmed,
Yeah.
and you're surrounded by thousands of people who basically share your deepest moral, political, and spiritual convictions.
Right, you're in your community.
Exactly. And up on this massive screen at the front of the room, projected in this inescapable text, is a single number.
Just one number?
Just one. 153 million.
Wow.
Yeah, 153 million. That was the staggering, just emotionally charged figure of orphans globally that were claimed to be waiting for a home in the early 2000s.
That is a massive number to process.
It is. So just sit with the sheer weight of that metric for a moment. If you are sitting in that room and you are told that 153 million children are completely alone in the world, you don't just walk out and go grab a coffee.
No, of course not. You'd feel sick.
Right. You feel this absolute unshakable moral obligation to act. Like a fire is lit under you.
It's the kind of astronomical figure that it really bypasses the analytical brain entirely.
Yeah, totally.
It just goes straight for the heart. It demands this immediate radical response from you. And, in the early 2000s, an entire cultural and religious movement, specifically the American Evangelical Church, looked at that exact number and felt a collective divine mandate to solve it.
They really did.
They basically built a massive institutional machine to bring those children into their homes.
And the arc of that machine, that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are tracking the meteoric rise, the massive institutional boom, and the profound fundamental reform of the American evangelical orphan care movement.
Right, roughly from the early 2000s right up to this really watershed moment in 2020.
Exactly. And our stack of sources for this deep dive is intense. We've got the foundational theological texts that literally built the movement, official policy statements from massive adoption agencies like Bethany Christian Services, and the really rigorous investigative journalism from empirical critics, particularly Kathryn Joyce.
Yeah, her work is heavily featured here.
It is, because our mission today is to look at the mechanics of a movement, how a deeply held theology completely transformed international adoption, right? And the structural collision between those intense religious motivations and the brutal reality of global child welfare.
And ultimately how the movement eventually forced its own reckoning.
Yeah. But before we get into the weeds, I think we need to set some ground rules for you listeners.
Absolutely. We have to do a quick impartiality disclaimer here. Because this is a highly charged intersection, right? We're talking about religion, politics, and child welfare.
Yeah, people have very strong feelings about all three of those.
They do. So the goal today is not, I repeat, not to declare a winner or take a side or pass judgment on the beliefs of the movement or the motives of its critics.
Right.
Instead, we are objectively laying out the strongest, most sincere arguments of the evangelical orphan care movement, and then the strongest empirical arguments of its critics, and we're just going to let that tension stand.
Which is hard to do, but so necessary so you can fully grasp the complexity of this issue. Because to really understand how that auditorium moment happens, how you get thousands of people ready to change their life plans and fly across the world to adopt a child, you actually have to rewind, way past the 2000s.
You really do. You have to look at the historical precedent that planted the seed.
Right.
So the sources point us back to the 1950s, specifically to a family named the Holts.
Oh, yeah, the Holt family.
Yeah. So in the aftermath of the Korean War, the Holt family, who were driven profoundly by their Christian faith, they basically pioneered the evangelical-driven Korean adoption model.
Okay.
They saw these children left orphaned and destitute by this brutal geopolitical conflict, and they moved mountains, they navigated an era with very little international adoption infrastructure to bring those children to the United States.
I found the Holt family history so critical to this, because it establishes the origin myth of the modern movement.
It really does. It set a profound historical precedent that combining Christian faith with the physical rescue of children across international borders wasn't just an act of charity. It was a heroic, faithful act.
Yes.
It established this paradigm of faith-based child rescue that kind of lay somewhat dormant, or at least operated at a steady, quiet baseline for a few decades.
Right. It was there, but it wasn't a mass movement yet.
Exactly. But then we hit the 2000s, And that baseline completely shatters.
It does. It totally shatters. Because in the 2000s, you start seeing this loose constellation of pastors, theologians, and agency directors. And they began to synthesize something that would come to be known as orphan theology.
Orphan theology. Okay, let's unpack this because this is huge.
It's the engine of the whole thing. They basically took that underlying intuitive impulse of the Holtz and codified it into a rigorous theological framework.
Right.
And the absolute bedrock of this was a specific verse from the Christian New Testament, James 1.27.
Which says what exactly? It speaks about caring for orphans and widows in their distress. And the leaders of this new movement, they didn't read that verse as a gentle suggestion or like a beautiful metaphor about general kindness.
Oh, no. They interpreted it as a direct, non-negotiable mandate from God.
Exactly.
And we really have to emphasize this shift from good work to mandate, because it changes the entire psychological landscape for a person.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if I think volunteering at a soup kitchen is a good idea, I'll go when I have free time, right?
Right, on a Saturday if you're not busy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if I think the creator of the universe has specifically commanded me to do it, I will rearrange my entire life to make it happen.
That is the exact shift in mindset.
And the theological architecture, it didn't just stop with a single verse in the book of James. It was built out significantly by theologians who connected the act of adopting a child to the very core mechanism of the Christian gospel.
Yes, and you see this vividly in the work of theologian Dan Kruver.
Yeah, I was reading his 2011 work, Reclaiming Adoption.
What did you think of it?
Well, the distinction he makes between vertical and horizontal adoption is genuinely fascinating. He puts this incredible amount of theological weight on the actual act of bringing a child into your home.
He does. And Kruver's framework became incredibly influential because it provided a robust vocabulary for what many families were already feeling.
Right, so break down vertical adoption for us.
So vertical adoption refers to the core Protestant theological concept that believers who were once alienated from God due to sin are legally and spiritually adopted by God into his family through faith.
Okay, so it's the idea that God is the ultimate original adopter.
Exactly. The action moves vertically from the divine down to humanity. So horizontal adoption, then, is human beings adopting human children.
Horizontal. Human to human.
Yes. And Kruver and the broader movement, they position horizontal adoption not just as a nice earthly parallel to a spiritual reality. They framed it as the natural, necessary, almost inevitable overflow of vertical adoption. The logic is basically, if you have experienced the radical vertical adoption of God rescuing you, you are practically compelled to act out that adoption horizontally toward a vulnerable child.
It's almost like they viewed human adoption as a living fractal of salvation.
Oh, a fractal. I like that.
Yeah, think about a fractal, right? The pattern repeats at every scale, from the macro to the micro.
Right.
So if God rescued and adopted humanity on this massive cosmic scale, then humans rescuing and adopting children is the ultimate flesh and blood mirror of the gospel on a human scale.
That's a perfect analogy.
You are physically pantomiming the salvation story right in your own living room. You aren't just raising a kid, you are providing a living testimony of the gospel to your neighbors, to your church, and, to the child themselves.
And that living fractal concept, that is exactly how it was preached from the pulpit. It really elevated adoption from a civic good to an absolute embodiment of the faith itself.
Wow.
And no one articulated this more effectively or with more institutional power behind him than Russell Moore.
Ah, Russell Moore.
Yes. Moore was a really prominent Southern Baptist theologian, and in 2009, he published a book called Adopted for Life. And if you ask observers of this movement to point to the match that lit the powder keg,
They point to this book.
they point directly to this book. Moore is widely credited with launching this theology from, just academic circles into a massive grassroots movement.
But he wasn't just writing a book in a vacuum, though. He used the massive institutional machinery available to him to force a real culture shift.
He absolutely leveraged his position. That exact same year, 2009, Moore authored a resolution on adoption and orphan care that was officially adopted by the Southern Baptist Convention.
Which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States.
Yes, it's massive. And he explicitly tied orphan care to what evangelicals call the Great Commission, which is the final mandate of Jesus to go and make disciples of all nations.
So he tied it directly to evangelism.
He did. By linking adoption to the core duty of evangelism, and by framing it as a highly visible, proactive, pro-life witness, Moore essentially put adoption at the absolute center of evangelical identity in the 21st century.
It became the ultimate synthesis of their social and spiritual priority.
Exactly.
But, anytime you have a major theological shift that demands this much of its adherents, you are naturally going to face pushback from within your own house.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And the sources highlight that this orphan theology was not universally accepted by all Christian scholars. There was intense exegetical pushback.
Exegetical meaning how they interpret the scriptures.
Right. And I found the critique by David M. Smolin particularly compelling here.
Smolin is an interesting figure.
He is. He's a law professor, and he is actually an adoptive parent himself, so he has real skin in the game. And he provided this really rigorous takedown of how this new theology was using historical texts.
What was his main argument?
Well, he looked at the movement's heavy reliance on the Apostle Paul's use of the word adoption in the New Testament. The movement was essentially saying, look, Paul talks about adoption all the time as the core of our faith, therefore God wants us to adopt orphans.
Right, drawing a direct line.
But Smolin argued that this reading of Paul is entirely historically uninformed.
Because of the Roman context.
Yes. Smolin's critique zeroes in on the cultural context of the first century Roman Empire. When Paul wrote about adoption, he was communicating with people living under Greco-Roman law.
Right.
And in that specific historical context, adoption was almost never about rescuing a vulnerable, destitute infant or a street child.
No, it was completely different. Roman adoption, governed by the laws of patria potestas, was primarily a mechanism for adult heirship.
Wait, adult heirship?
Yeah. So if a wealthy Roman patriarch, like a senator or an aristocrat, didn't have a suitable male heir to pass on his estate, his family name, and his political alliances,
He would just adopt one.
he would adopt a young adult male, often from another aristocratic family.
So it was essentially a legal mechanism for the transfer of wealth, status, and power to ensure the continuation of a dynasty.
Exactly.
It had absolutely nothing to do with child welfare or humanitarian rescue.
Precisely. It was a corporate merger disguised as a family dynamic.
Wow.
So Smolin argues that taking a first-century Roman legal concept about elite adult heirs and retrofitting it to justify a 21st century movement of international child rescue is a massive theological stretch.
Yeah, he's saying it's reading modern Western sensibilities back into ancient texts.
Exactly. The theological foundation, at least from an academic standpoint, was built on an anachronism.
So you have this really fascinating internal debate happening. One side says the theology commands us to adopt the fatherless. The other side says you're totally misunderstanding the historical context of the text you're using to build this entire multi-million-dollar infrastructure.
Right. Huge clash.
But the reality of history is that while the theology was hotly debated among scholars and academic journals, on the ground in the megachurches and small groups, it was incredibly effective. Orphan theology mobilized people.
It absolutely worked.
But as any community organizer knows, to mobilize a massive, sustained movement, abstract theology isn't enough. You need a quantifiable crisis.
You need a metric.
You need a metric that proves the urgency of the theology, which leads us straight back to that 153 million statistic and the institutional boom that followed it.
And the speed at which the movement built its institutional infrastructure around that metric is genuinely breathtaking.
Oh, it's wild.
If you look at the timeline, we can trace it back to a tiny event in 2004 called the Orphan Summit in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Just a small gathering.
Yeah, it was just 29 leaders gathering to talk about how the church could do better at orphan care. Just 29 people. But from that tiny seed, an incredible coalition was born.
The Christian Alliance for Orphans, or CAFO.
CAFO, yes.
Yeah. It was officially incorporated in 2007. And reading about their growth under the leadership of Jed Middefind from 2009 onward, I mean, it's a masterclass in coalition building.
They were so organized.
They managed to knit together over 300 different organizations. They took hundreds of previously siloed, sometimes competitive local ministries and adoption agencies, and they brought them under a unified, focused umbrella. They created a juggernaut.
They streamlined the messaging and pooled their resources. And it wasn't just niche, specialized ministries participating either. This movement reached the absolute heights of evangelical pop culture.
Yeah. Talk about Saddleback.
Right. So consider 2012 when CAFO held its summit at Saddleback Church in California. Now, Saddleback was pastored by Rick and Kay Warren. Rick Warren authored The Purpose-Driven Life,
which is literally one of the best-selling nonfiction books in human history.
Exactly. So having the Warrens host the summit and explicitly set an audacious goal of placing the world's orphans in families, that was a massive cultural signal.
It meant orphan care had fully captured the zeitgeist.
It was no longer a fringe interest for a few passionate families. It was the mainstream defining evangelical cause of the decade.
And the fuel for that engine, the rallying cry that was repeated from pulpits, printed in newsletters, and projected on those huge screens at massive summits, was that statistic. 153 million orphans worldwide.
The big number.
The big number. And we really have to look closer at that number because the sources are adamant that this metric was highly contested and fundamentally misunderstood by the public.
Highly misunderstood.
The way that number was presented as 153 million parentless children sitting in institutions just waiting for Western family to rescue them was deeply flawed.
Yes.
Because when demographers and global health experts actually deconstruct the data behind that number, an entirely different reality emerges.
What's fascinating here is that the statistic itself originated from reputable global organizations like UNICEF.
Okay, so it wasn't a made-up number.
No, it wasn't made up. But the movement stripped it of its demographic context. The entire issue hinges on the definition of the word orphan. In common Western parlance, an orphan is a child who has lost both parents. What international experts classify as a double orphan.
Which is what everyone in that auditorium pictured.
Exactly. But the 153 million figure included what are known as single orphans.
And a single orphan is a child who has lost one parent, but still has a surviving biological parent.
Yes. The vast, vast majority of the children making up that 153 million number had a living parent. Or, if both parents were deceased, they were living with an aunt, a grandmother, or extended family within their community.
They weren't totally alone.
No. They were certainly vulnerable. Many were living in extreme, grinding poverty. They might be missing a father due to a regional conflict, or a mother due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which heavily influenced the data at that specific time.
Right.
But they were not blank slates severed from human connection. They were deeply embedded in families and communities that were struggling under the crushing weight of systemic poverty.
Which brings up a really critical question, I think, for you listening. Did this metric actually document a crisis? Or did the framing of the metric manufacture a specific type of crisis?
That's the real question.
Because if you look at a community devastated by poverty and disease, and you say, look at all these children who have lost a father, they're officially orphans, your proposed solution is going to be adoption.
Right, you're going to try to extract the child to save them from the environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you look at that exact same community and say, look at all these single mothers struggling to feed their kids,
Yeah.
your solution is entirely different.
Totally different.
You don't extract the child. You provide microloans, agricultural support, medical care, clean water. You try to support the family, not replace it.
Right.
So by using the word orphan for all 153 million children, the movement essentially misdiagnosed the reality of global poverty. It turned a complex structural need for community support into this simple, overwhelming demand for foreign adopters.
And that misdiagnosis had profound global consequences. Because the demand to adopt wasn't just driven by a misunderstood number. It was driven by the highest possible stakes imaginable within this belief system.
Right, the spiritual stakes.
Exactly. It wasn't just about giving a child a better economic future or moving them from a developing nation to a developed one. In the minds of the movement, it was fundamentally about saving a child's eternal soul.
Which brings us to the concept of saving children twice. This is where the humanitarian impulse to provide good life and the religious impulse to evangelize just totally fuse together.
It creates a motivation that is incredibly powerful.
But, as we see in the sources, also incredibly fraught.
Let's examine the mechanics of that fusion. In the evangelical worldview, salvation knowing God, accepting the Christian gospel is the ultimate good. It supersedes all earthly concerns.
Right.
Therefore, adopting a child from a non-Christian background or a poverty-stricken area wasn't merely a physical rescue, it was a spiritual rescue mission.
You are saving them physically from poverty, malnutrition, or institutionalization. And you are saving them spiritually by bringing them into a Christian home where they will be evangelized and introduced to the faith.
And the movement utilized deeply effective emotional language to describe this process. They talked constantly about children coming home, meaning coming home to their adoptive earthly family, but also spiritually coming home to God.
You really have to place this within the broader cultural context of the American church at the time, too. The sources highlight that for evangelicals, the orphan care movement offered something deeply needed within their own cultural identity. It was a concrete, actionable, irrefutable good works component to their faith.
It's a vital piece of the puzzle, because many evangelicals felt that over the preceding decades, they had ceded the territory of social justice and humanitarian work to more liberal mainline denominations or secular NGOs.
Right, they wanted back in.
They wanted a way back into the space of caring for the poor and vulnerable that felt authentically theirs, rooted in their own theology rather than secular humanism.
That makes a lot of sense.
Furthermore, it served as a very tangible, proactive, pro-life answer to the ongoing political debates surrounding abortion.
Oh, the pro-life connection.
Yes. It allowed the church to say, we aren't just legislating against abortion, we are actively opening our homes and our wallets to provide for unwanted or vulnerable children. It was a way to live out their values in a way that the rest of the world could plainly see and measure.
And I want to pause here. I think it's really important to ensure we give the movement's genuine humanitarian motives their full, unvarnished weight.
Absolutely.
Because they didn't just hold conferences and talk about it. They did the grueling work, and they had a massive positive impact, particularly domestically.
Yes, the domestic impact was huge.
Look at Focus on the Family's Wait No More initiative, which launched around 2008. They focused their immense organizational power intensely on domestic foster care and adoption within the United States. And the impact was measurable and undeniable.
What did they achieve?
They were literally credited with helping to cut the state of Colorado's waiting children list in foster care, roughly in half.
Half! That is a staggering logistical and humanitarian achievement.
Right. It speaks to the incredible mobilizing power and genuine compassion of this community. When they directed their energy toward the domestic foster care system, a system where there really were children who had been legally severed from their biological parents by the state due to abuse or severe neglect and who were desperately waiting for homes, they achieved real, verifiable good.
You cannot accurately look at the history of this movement without acknowledging that thousands of children found loving, stable homes because of these massive church-led efforts.
So what does this all mean? The tension here is fascinating. You have a community that is genuinely motivated, achieving real good domestically, but driven by a theology that explicitly equates the bureaucratic process of adoption with spiritual salvation.
Right.
And here's where the tension snaps. When child placement is inextricably linked to soul winning, the whole endeavor gains a sacred urgency.
Sacred urgency, yeah.
And the danger is that when a legal, secular process becomes a divine mandate, the impulse to maximize placements can easily crowd out the necessary gatekeeping.
The red tape.
Exactly. Think about why adoption has so much red tape, background checks, psychological evaluations, verifying the legal status of the child, ensuring biological parents aren't being coerced. It's slow and frustrating.
Very slow.
But if every adoption is viewed as a spiritual victory, then any red tape, any delay, any government regulation that slows down the process can start to look like an obstacle to God's will.
And that is the defining structural blind spot of the movement. You have an overwhelming religiously fueled demand driven by a contested statistic and imbued with sacred urgency.
Yeah.
It creates an environment where the eagerness to rescue utterly outpaces the diligence required to ensure the rescue is actually needed or legally sound. And this exact sacred urgency is what investigative journalists began to flag.
They started looking at the supply chain.
They started looking at the global supply chain of international adoption and realized that this massive American demand engine was creating profound, devastating distortions in developing nations.
Which introduces Kathryn Joyce to our deep dive. She is an investigative journalist and the author of the 2013 book, The Child Catchers: Rescue, Trafficking, and the New Gospel of Adoption.
She's a key figure here.
Yeah, if Russell Moore is the theological architect of the movement, Kathryn Joyce is its leading empirical critic. I was reading her analysis of the economics involved, and it is, it's chilling.
Joyce's central thesis focuses heavily on the raw economics of the adoption boom. She argued that there was a massive supply and demand distortion.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Well, you had a surging, highly motivated pool of Western, predominantly Christian adopters armed with tens of thousands of dollars in adoption fees.
Right.
But as we noted when deconstructing the 153 million number, there was actually a relatively thin supply of genuinely parentless, legally clear children available for international adoption.
So there's this huge demand, very little supply, and a lot of cash. Let's break down the mechanics of that money. An American family might pay anywhere from $25,000 to $40,000 to an agency to facilitate an international adoption.
That's a lot of money.
That covers agency fees, travel, legal paperwork, and fees paid to local facilitators in the source country. Now, in a developing nation, even a fraction of that fee trickling down to a local child finder or orphanage director represents a massive, life-altering sum of money.
When you inject that kind of wealth into a deeply impoverished legal and social system, combined with weak or non-existent international regulations, you create a deeply perverse incentive structure.
Yeah.
Joyce's reporting indicated that in numerous cases, agencies and local facilitators were essentially financially rewarded for manufacturing orphans to meet the Western demand.
Manufacturing an orphan. That phrase just hurts to say.
It's awful.
I want to spend time on the Liberia case study from 2009 because it illustrates exactly how the supply chain operated on the ground.
Liberia is a stark example.
It really is. So Liberia was recovering from years of brutal, devastating civil war. The infrastructure was decimated and poverty was rampant. Suddenly, it became a hot spot for American adoptions.
Why Liberia?
Well, the process there was fast. It was relatively cheap compared to established programs in other countries. And crucially, many of the agencies operating there were unaccredited and operating in a legal gray area. So local child finders would go out into rural villages. They weren't looking for abandoned children. They were approaching families who were intact but struggling to survive.
And the result of this unregulated gold rush was disastrous. The pipeline became so corrupted with forged documents and coerced relinquishments that it led to a complete emergency moratorium on all adoptions by the Liberian government.
Yeah, they literally shut it down, citing gross mismanagement.
And the moratorium was the geopolitical red flag, right? But Joyce's reporting uncovered the agonizing human details behind that mismanagement.
The human cost is just devastating.
One of the most painful mechanics of this exploitation was the issue of cultural mistranslation.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because this is a critical point for understanding the total disconnect between the two worlds involved.
Absolutely. So in places like Liberia or Ethiopia, which became another massive hub for adoptions during this era, the Western legal concept of adoption simply did not exist in the local cultural vocabulary.
Right. In Western law, adoption represents a clean break. The biological parent's legal rights are permanently severed and entirely transferred to the adoptive parents. The child literally gets a new birth certificate.
Exactly. But in many of these developing nations, child rearing is deeply communal. They have long-standing customs of temporary guardianship.
Temporary guardianship.
Yes. So if a family is struggling through a famine or extreme poverty, they might send their child to live with a wealthier relative or a benefactor in the city for a few years to get an education or simply survive.
But the expectation is that they come back.
Yes, with the absolute, unquestioned expectation that the child will return and that the biological family remains the family.
So you had local child finders going to these parents in rural villages, using local dialects, and offering to take their child to America for an education. They framed it as a scholarship opportunity.
Yes. Many biological parents were told, or led to believe through deliberate cultural mistranslation, that the arrangement was temporary schooling. They thought they were sending their child to a boarding school in the West.
Oh, man.
They were completely unaware that the documents they were signing, often marked only with a thumbprint because they could not read the legal text, permanently severed their parental rights.
They had no idea they might never see their child again.
None.
The psychological devastation of that is hard to fathom. A mother thinks she is making a sacrifice to get her child an education, only to realize years later that she legally gave her child away to strangers.
It's horrific.
And this brings us to Joyce's argument about the blindness of moral certainty. Because Joyce wasn't arguing that these thousands of evangelical adoptive parents were malicious actors looking to steal children.
No, not at all.
She recognized their genuine, heartfelt desire to help. But she argued that the movement was structurally primed to overlook this corruption because its theology supplied total moral certainty.
Right. If you genuinely believe, at the absolute core of your being, that you are doing God's work by rescuing a child from poverty and bringing them into a Christian home, you might subconsciously ignore red flags in the paperwork.
You don't want to see them.
You don't. You might not ask the hard, uncomfortable questions about where the child really came from or how the agency secured the relinquishment documents, because the end result, the salvation and rescue of the child, justifies the murky, bureaucratic means.
And the sources even highlight this shocking legal detail regarding how agencies handled this risk. Some adoptive parents were contractually warned by their adoption agencies that the information they were receiving about the child's origins might be inaccurate or entirely fabricated.
Contractually warned.
Yeah. Essentially, the agencies were putting clauses in contracts saying, we cannot guarantee this child is actually an orphan, or that the background story is true, but sign here to accept the risk.
Wow.
They were shifting the legal and moral liability to the adoptive parents rather than fixing the broken, corrupt supply chain they were actively profiting from.
It was a system that prioritized the final placement of the child over the rigorous ethical verification of the child's status.
Yeah.
And as these stories started to break internationally in Liberia, in Ethiopia, in Guatemala, in Kyrgyzstan, the tension between the movement's beautiful theology and the ugly, exploitative reality of the global market became impossible to ignore.
Now, the evangelical community didn't just sit back and absorb these critiques from journalists like Joyce in silence.
No, I didn't.
They responded vigorously. They mounted a fierce defense of the movement's core integrity, and, in some crucial defining ways, they also began to self-correct from the inside.
Examining the evangelical rebuttal is essential to getting the full picture of how the community processed this crisis.
Let's talk about the defense first.
Okay, so following the publication of Joyce's work and the ensuing mainstream media coverage, there was significant pushback. A prime example is a 2013 piece published in Christianity Today, which serves as a flagship magazine for the evangelical movement.
What was it called?
The piece was titled "The Good Heart of the Adoption Movement."
The Good Heart. The title alone tells you exactly what they are prioritizing. They are defending the fundamental sincerity and the underlying motives of the people involved.
Exactly. The defense mounted in that piece, and by leaders across the movement, argued that empirical critics like Joyce were relying far too heavily on worst-case anecdotes.
Right.
They argued that you cannot take the rare, albeit tragic, instances of trafficking in the name of rescue and use them to completely negate the thousands upon thousands of legitimate, life-saving, beautiful adoptions that occurred legally and ethically.
So they were basically saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes. They fiercely pushed back against the idea that the entire system was inherently corrupt, arguing instead that it was a system of genuine care that was occasionally tragically exploited by bad actors on the ground in foreign countries.
But it wasn't just external defense against journalists.
Yeah.
There were major internal warnings happening as well.
Yes, that there were.
Movement leaders themselves started to recognize the dangers of the hype machine they had helped create. Think back to Russell Moore, the theologian who wrote the book that arguably started the whole boom.
Right, adopted for life.
By 2011, he is issuing a stark warning to his followers titled, "Don't Adopt."
Which is an incredible rhetorical pivot from his earlier stance.
It really is. Don't adopt. He cautioned his audience against what he called bandwagon adoption.
Bandwagon adoption.
Yeah, he recognized that adoption had become almost trendy in some evangelical circles, a sort of status symbol of spiritual maturity or a badge of honor.
Like a checklist for being a good Christian.
Exactly. And he had to remind his followers that not everyone is called by God to adopt, and that doing it for the wrong reasons or getting swept up in the emotional high of a massive conference without understanding the severe, lifelong trauma and psychological complexities involved for the child was deeply dangerous for both the parents and the child.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when you look at both the defense and the internal warnings, you are looking at the core tension of this entire history.
Right.
The leaders of the movement were genuinely moved by compassion. They achieved real, undeniable good, particularly in the domestic foster care space where the legal systems were robust. But, as the critics empirically demonstrated, good intentions simply do not negate systemic incentives that produce harm.
It's the profound friction between the personal narrative and the systemic reality.
Well said.
You can have a beautiful personal story of an adoptive family who brought a child into their home, loved them, cared for them, provided a wonderful life, and honored their heritage. That story is real, it is valid, And it happened thousands of times.
Countless times, yes.
And simultaneously, you can have a systemic reality where the massive economic demand created by millions of people wanting that exact same beautiful story fuels child trafficking, document forgery, and the exploitation of poor, intact families in the developing world.
Both realities exist simultaneously.
Personal rescues occurred right alongside and often inadvertently funded structural exploitation.
Sitting with that tension is difficult, but it's really the only way to understand the monumental shift that happened next, because that tension couldn't hold forever.
Something had to give.
Right. As the 2010s progressed, the global reality of international relations, geopolitical shifting, and child welfare policy began to forcefully close the doors that the movement had relied upon.
We start to see the craters of international adoption. Throughout the 2010s, the entire global landscape shifts completely beneath their feet. Major source countries for adoptions, countries that had been reliably sending thousands of children to the U.S. every year, start slamming their doors shut.
Guatemala, for instance.
Yes. Guatemala closes down entirely after massive investigations reveal systemic corruption and baby-selling networks. Russia completely halts all adoptions to the U.S.
Though Russia's closure was largely political retaliation tied to the Magnitsky Act.
True, but they utilize the rhetoric of child protection to justify it. And then Ethiopia, after years of scandals mirroring exactly what happened in Liberia with cultural mistranslation and unaccredited agencies, drastically scales back and eventually closes down its international adoption program.
The global supply chain essentially collapses.
Which brings our timeline to its climax. We arrive at January 2020.
The big pivot.
Bethany Christian Services. They are the largest Protestant Christian adoption agency in the United States. Over the course of 37 years, they had placed roughly 15,000 children internationally. They were an absolute titan of the orphan care movement, deeply respected and hugely influential.
Right.
In early 2020, they make a shocking public announcement. They announce that they are entirely, permanently ending their international adoption programs.
Not pausing them to review protocols. Ending them.
Ending them completely. It's a massive tectonic shift for the organization and the movement. So what did they decide to do instead? They completely redefined their approach to global childcare. Yeah. Bethany announced that their new focus and funding would be entirely directed toward in-country family preservation and strengthening local care in developing nations.
It is hard to overstate what a massive theological and institutional about-face this was.
Oh, it's huge.
For decades, the movement had championed the idea of bringing the child out of the developing world and integrating them into the Western Christian home. By pivoting to family preservation, Bethany was essentially admitting that the older model was fundamentally flawed.
Right.
They were officially endorsing the idea that keeping families intact in their home countries, financially supporting the biological parents so they don't have to relinquish their children due to poverty, and building up local child welfare systems is the superior, more ethical model of care.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because Bethany's pivot leaves this massive, unresolved question hanging in the air. And it's the question that still defines the legacy of this movement.
Okay, what's the question?
Was Bethany's 2020 pivot an act of pure, principled reform?
Right.
Like, did they listen to the rigorous critiques of people like Kathryn Joyce, examine the structural harm their demand was creating, experience a profound crisis of institutional conscience, and bravely decide to change their ways despite the cost? Or was it a pragmatic, economic business response to a declining market? As we saw, the major source countries were closing, the global supply chain was shrinking. Was the pivot just a reality of an agency realizing they simply didn't have a product to offer anymore?
That remains the open, fiercely contested question among observers. And realistically, as with most massive institutional shifts, it is likely a complex, messy mixture of both.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The shifting geopolitical economics forced them to look at the ethical critiques more closely, and the ethical critiques provided the necessary moral framework for their new economic direction.
Right.
But regardless of the exact ratio of motive, the historical result is the same. The defining institution of the movement walked away from the very model it had spent decades championing.
What an incredible complex arc.
It really is.
We've journeyed from an interpretation of a single scripture in the book of James to the building of a massive institutional coalition that captured the cultural zeitgeist of an entire religious demographic.
And we saw how the deeply held, sincere desire to save souls collided with the brutal realities of global poverty, cultural mistranslation, and the unforgiving laws of supply and demand economics.
And finally, we saw how the movement faced with global closures and empirical critiques, eventually pivoted toward family preservation.
The history here serves as a masterclass in several critical human vulnerabilities. It shows us how easily statistics, stripped of their context, can be misunderstood and misused to manufacture a specific type of crisis.
The 153 million.
Exactly. It demonstrates how total moral certainty can create devastating structural blind spots, allowing genuinely well-meaning people to participate in and fund harmful systems without realizing it.
Yeah.
And it proves that good intentions, no matter how sincere or deeply felt, must always be paired with rigorous, structural accountability and a willingness to listen to outside critics.
It's a heavy, fascinating lesson about the mechanics of doing good in a complex world. And we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Yeah, think about this.
We've seen how the language of rescue inadvertently blinded a massive, well-funded movement to the local realities of families in the developing world. So we have to ask ourselves, what other global humanitarian, environmental, or charitable efforts are we currently misdiagnosing right now?
Oh, that's a good question.
When we view complex global issues purely through the lens of our own cultural, religious, or economic solutions, who ends up paying the unseen price for our good intentions?
It's a question that demands continuous, rigorous self-reflection from all of us, no matter what causes we support. Thank you for exploring the complexities of this history with us.
Yes, thank you for being here with us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Take care and keep asking the hard questions.